welcome to Lesson 7-3. This is the 1950s. Today we're going to start by looking at the domestic scene of the 1950s. That is, what did America look like at home? Well, we know that in the post-war period, after World War II, this was a prosperous time for America. America as a whole was doing very well. But like in previous economic booms, this prosperity does not reach all Americans. The middle class, those who are accumulating money, they're going to be moving out of the cities. They're going to be moving into suburbs and building wealthier communities with larger houses and larger lawns. And the taxes that these people pay, they move out of the cities with them. And these suburbs become very wealthy places where a lot of city supports exist, city services are strong, city schools are good. But the inner cities, the big cities which are being abandoned, they fall into urban decay. Urban decay is what happens when a large population center loses all of its wealth, all of its tax base. The roads start to fall apart, the sewers start to fall apart. The school systems fall into decline. Now, why does this happen, or how does this happen? Well, it happens in part because President Eisenhower passes the Highway Act of 1956. The Highway Act of 1956 is going to build the American interstate system, going to put in all those big roads to move cars quickly and easily across long distances. He does this in part because he saw the Germans had done this throughout Germany, and that was a part of their success in World War II, their ability to move people and equipment very quickly. Now, once we have our interstates, this fuels the growth of more suburbs, more businesses, and it makes it easier for Americans to move into other areas of the country, places where it was just too difficult to access without the highway system. This better transportation begins a huge movement of Americans out of the upper Midwest and Northeast down into the American South and West. And we start to see a population boom in what we call America's Sun Belt, our southern states. In addition to the transportation and the economic booms, we also have a baby boom. We actually call a whole generation of Americans the boomers or the baby boomers. This happens because during World War II, men and women had put off marrying and put off having children. Many men were off fighting the war, or they were busy in the war effort in other ways, and it wasn't the right time to start a family. Americans were still poor from the effects of the Great Depression. They didn't have money for a house and a car and all those extras that you need when you have a family. But after the war, Americans have jobs, they have savings, they're building the new houses, and they're all starting families at the same time. And in the 1950s, America experienced a tremendous baby boom, a skyrocketing of people in their 20s and 30s settling down and deciding to have a family at the same time. Now, politically speaking, President Eisenhower was somebody who advocated what he called a middle course. President Eisenhower was a conservative. He was a conservative Republican. He did not like the New Deal and did not believe that it was the government's job to help make American lives better. However, in his campaign, when he was running for president, he promised to steer a middle course. He was a conservative Republican who recognized that the country had a whole bunch of liberal Democrats in it, and that he needed to be a president for everyone. So while he did govern as a conservative, he was a conservative Republican president, he balanced that out by promising not to undo the New Deal policies, to acknowledge that while the Democratic liberal presidents were in charge, they had established these policies for the nation, and I'm not going to cancel them. But moving forward, we're going to move forward more conservatively. This made him tremendously popular with nearly all Americans. Republicans loved that we were taking a new direction, a more conservative direction, and Democrats appreciated that their president was not going to undo all of the progress of the progressive movement in the 1930s and 40s. Eisenhower was a wildly popular president. Now let's look at the American culture itself in the 1950s. Many historians consider the 1950s to be the high point of American history, the peak of American power and strength and wealth. We were strong, wealthy, happy, and mostly free from foreign threat. The Soviet Union existed, but we weren't in super tense conflicts with them. We had the Korean War going on, but once that wound down, and keep in mind, Korean War never threatened American safety. And especially once that winds down, the rest of the 1950s is relatively quiet. In those years, life was good for most Americans. A little bit more on the economic boom here. In the 1950s, middle-class Americans, if you had a good, steady factory job, it was expected that you could afford a house, you could afford a car, and you could afford appliances. This was fairly new to American life, that everybody or most people would be able to afford a refrigerator, a washer, dryer, a gas stove. These were all new to the American middle class. Before this, it was ice boxes and wood-fired stoves or coal-fired stoves. These were now new things that used to be luxuries and now are becoming more affordable for the middle class. Also, with less work needed to run a home, now that we have refrigerators and laundry appliances, many women are able to enter the workforce. And they're able to go out and get jobs and add income to the household. And we see another surge in women entering the workplace. The 1950s is the birth of rock and roll. When a nation is wealthy, when a nation is at peace, its art and its culture flourish. They do exceptionally well. And during the 1950s, we were wealthy and we were at peace, and American culture exploded. People went to the theater for movies and plays, and they enjoyed new styles of music, including rock and roll. Elvis Presley comes out in the 1950s. Chuck Berry comes out in the 1950s. And Americans are enjoying this new style music. We also see an explosion in television. This becomes the golden age of American television. It becomes a very popular source of entertainment. And by the 1960s, by 1960, 90% of American households own a TV. And they're all sitting at home and watching these programs, which it's worth mentioning. We're only talking about a time where there were 5, 6 channels. ABC, NBC, CBS, those were the big three. Those were your channels. So Americans are watching the same television programs. There aren't 385 different channels. It's just 3. So when America sits down to watch the news, they're watching the same news program. When they sit down to watch a television drama or comedy, they're watching the same ones. And it develops this sort of common culture, something that is seen across the entire country. Now, some people will rebel against this. Some people are not happy with the idea of American popular culture or pop culture, the things that all Americans are tied into. They believe that too much importance is being placed on money. And Americans are too quick to conform to what they see on television as being the norm for everybody. These beatniks believe that Americans should have their own lives, that we should focus on being more of ourselves, and that this whole pop culture idea is a serious flaw in our society. And these beatnik poets and writers love to highlight those social flaws in America. The fact that America is becoming perhaps less free because of its wealth. This new concern about American lifestyles seeps into our culture. And by the 1960s, we're not all that happy with our prosperity. Yes, we're wealthy. Yes, we've got all the stuff that we want. But the stuff, this money, is not actually making us happier. And they worry about this. And in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy, right here, runs for president under One of his slogans being to get this country moving again, to get Americans energized again, feeling like we've got a purpose rather than just sitting on our couches watching our televisions and enjoying our wealth. And despite of the success of the Eisenhower years, and they were successful in most measurable ways, Kennedy, a Democrat, progressive Democrat, is able to narrowly defeat Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon, in the presidential election of that year. And America is going to enter the 1960s with a very different view on our own domestic situation and the world as a result of Kennedy's election. All right, well, today we covered the domestic scene in the 1950s and how America is changing in these post-war years. We talked about the culture of the 1950s and how wealth and prosperity was leading to significant changes in American life, and how eventually we rebel against those very same cultural changes in the election of John F. Kennedy. I hope that you learned something today and that you enjoyed this lesson. I'll see you next time. Farewell.